So every single Sunday at First Christian Church in Arlington, Texas, Mary Todd stood right next to Dr. Digby, who was the senior pastor at First Christian Church in Arlington, Texas, where I grew up. I learned so much from Dr. Digby. He was the pastor at that church for 26 years, and I learned a lot about sticking in there and hanging in and being this source of good in the community. He was a very open-minded, thoughtful, wise person. He would preach, like in that day when everybody went to church and preachers didn't have to be entertaining, he would preach these, 25, 30-minute sermons that were really kind of like college lectures, right? And everybody sat there and listened. And more than once, he mentioned that he spent an hour in the study for every minute in the sermon. So I learned from that also that preaching was really important, that it was something that took a lot of study and dedication, and it was really important to pour your heart into it. But more than that, I learned everything I needed to know about what a church was from seeing Mary Todd, who is this church lady with these little horn-rimmed glasses and this little sweet dress, who stood right next to Dr. Digby every Sunday when people walked out, and she had a little notepad and she wrote down everything people said. Heather made first chair violin, and the twins are having surgery next Tuesday, and Wednesday is a year since Elaine died in the car wreck. And she would write down every single thing, and I noticed that, of course, as a kid, and that told me that what really mattered in a church were the relationships, that the highs and lows, that people's lives were so critical to them. And I think everybody knows that that's true about me, that I know all about people and all about people's lives, and that to me is just part of being a pastor. But Dr. Digby did not invent that, right? I mean, that's what you see in Paul's letters. Paul wasn't one of Jesus' disciples. He was instead this kind of church planter, and he went around and he started these churches, and then they have conflict, and he'd write them these letters, which now we have collected in the New Testament. And those letters often had these words of greeting, and he would list people and he would thank the people. But this letter is a little different because the letter to the church at Rome, Paul had not been there. Paul didn't found this church, even though this is kind of his greatest work of theology. And what's really interesting about this 16th chapter of Romans, if you think it's interesting, is he gave it to a woman, Phoebe, and she's commended, and he's commending Phoebe, and he's saying, Phoebe, who's my deacon, who's my benefactor, is going to bring you this letter, which is really kind of amazing because that means she had the power, right? Mary Todd had the pen. I mean, she was going to bring this letter to the church at Rome, and then she was going to read it too. So scholars often point out that she was really sort of the first, person to write a commentary on Rome because she could put her own inflection in there. And then it wasn't just that, in a world, I don't know if you've been following the war, Israel, Hamas, if you look at the Houthi rebels in Yemen and everything, there's a lot of men out there, right? I mean, it's just like a sea of men around these tables. I mean, just like no women show up. So it's kind of amazing that here's this Phoebe who's put in this place of power. And then he goes on to greet 26 people in this church at Rome. Again, supposedly he'd never been there, right? Of the 26, 9 are women. And he calls them apostles, and he calls them, his fellow people. And he doesn't just list the 26 people. He puts little details by them. It's like Mary Todd was writing it down, like they stuck their neck out for you, and they got stoned, and they got hurt, and they got this and that, right? He knows all these details, which again just kind of like reconfirms what we know, which is like our lives are made of relationships. And like Thornton Wilder said, we know that, we just don't take it out and look at it very often. Epiphany is a time to take the things out and look at them. And we all know how important relationships are. Every single study, proves that. Many of you have seen through the years the report from that big Harvard study on happiness and health. It's kind of considered kind of the grandparent of studies, right? It was started in 1938. They took 724 men, they were all men in Boston. And at the time, Boston was largely white, but they took half of the men, I don't know if it was half, but were Harvard students, and then about half were immigrants, kind of poor people from the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in Boston. And they have followed these men now for 85 years. 85 years, like 60 of the men are still living. And every 2 years, they've done all these studies on these men, right? They've looked at their health, they've had them filled out questionnaires, they've talked to their family, they've talked to friends, and they've put them through a battery of tests and emotional tests and all this stuff. And what has come out is the most important thing to determine your health and your happiness. Is it your exercise or is it your diet? It's your relationships, right? I mean, over and over and over across every single you know, every single demographic group, it's your relationships. And we know that. We know that's so critical. And we know the absence of relationships is so bad for your health, right? It exacerbates diabetes and heart disease and Alzheimer's. It it pushes the progression of it. And it is so bad for depression. Looked at 106 things that go into warding off depression. Number one, to prevent depression, a confidant, a close friend is the number one preventer of serious depression, right? We all know this, and which is why kind of all the studies that talk about how lonely we are even more problematic. And we know, again, loneliness is on the rise. I mean, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, right? And when I was in seminary in the 80s, you know, we were reading Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and all these stories that showed how people's loneliness really kicked up in the 50s with the advent of television, you know, and it's what they call the plop factor. You come in and you plop down, and people, you know, around that time, people's, you know, being involved. And, you know, when I was a kid, every single person on the block went to church. I think now we're the only people who go to church, right? People are not as involved in any kind of group or club. And that really ticked up in 2012 with the advent of the iPhone. In 2012, the average American, this is stunning, in 2012, the average American spent 6.5 hours a week with friends. Today, the average American spends 2.5 hours with friends. That is like an unbelievable decrease in a decade, right? That people have just really, you know, this is what everybody's doing all the time. And we know who are the loneliest people in this, you know, in this country? People over 65 and Generation Z, people born between 97 and 2013. 75% of people in that age group say that they are either lonely sometimes or always. I mean, that is a really looming health crisis, right? And a lot of scholars talk about how friendships are not just important because of our own relationships. And like, you know, like they talk about intimate loneliness, which means, you know, you need a partner. And now 40% of Americans are unpartnered. But of course, we also know a lot of people can be super, super happy without a partner. But then relational loneliness, we all know we need other people beyond an intimate person. But then friendships going down. But then they talked about collective loneliness, which is why something like a peace church is so important. And I started working in a church in '83, and today I feel more than ever like what I do in life is try to build community. I mean, that's my gift to the world, is trying to create this. And Peace Church is a remarkable community. I mean, pat ourselves on the back. This is an open, warm, welcoming community. You know, it's not just book clubs and Bible and Brew. It's volunteering. It's trying to change the world. And this is the most open place. I mean, I'm standing here with God as my witness. There are not cliques in this church. If there are, I don't know about it. I mean, you walk in the door for the very first time and you can go ahead and start helping clean up afterwards, right? I mean, there is no bar before, like, oh no, you have to be here for a while before we're like, show you where to put the chairs, right? You just come in and you're right there put to work. But it's more than that. A lot of scholars talk about how relationships are so critical, not just to my health and how long I live, but to the health of democracy and society. And you don't have to look very far. January 6th insurrection, people on QAnon, and one of the things you hear over and over again is these people are what? Isolated and alone. They're in their house looking at all their doomsday scrolling craziness. Hannah Arendt was political philosopher, kind of one of the most famous political theorists from last century. Not that any of those people are like Taylor Swift famous, but Arendt was born in 1906, and then she died in 1975. She's German, Jewish. Her family fled Hitler in the 30s, went to France, and then she made her way to the United States. And she was a person who wrote a great deal about democracy and threats to democracy, like totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And she also wrote a bit about friendship, because she believed that friendship was subversive. She believed that friendships and real deep connections was one way that we pushed back against the kind of authoritarian figures and the dictators and the people who wanted to separate us. And she talked about how, like, when you have a friend, I mean, obviously we hang out with people who are more or less like us, but even our closest friends, I mean, I have 3 childhood friends from Texas, and as close as we are, there's still real ways in which we are really different. And sometimes in those differences, you know, I'm struck by that. And I'm struck by that says to me too, I'm an individual. I am an individual person, and so are you. And that friendship, Hannah Arendt believed, was really a way that we like refuse to devalue other people. We refuse to like wipe away people and, you know, to just kind of fall under like an autocrat who believed that people could just be wiped out. And she was famous for having these cocktail parties in her Riverside apartment in New York City with all these other intellectuals who worked at Columbia and wrote for the New Yorker, and they would drink martinis and they would argue about this and that. And then in '61, she went to Israel to cover the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Remember, the kind of architect of the Holocaust, and there was a huge trial. And she asked the New Yorker if she could go to Israel and cover this, and she wrote like 5 or 6 articles. And those articles really threatened her friendship, because what she talked about, she's the one who came up with that phrase, the banality of evil. She went to Israel, she covered the trial, and she said Adolf Eichmann, not really a monster, kind of an ordinary guy who just kind of took orders and went along with people. And she was really kind of saying there's something so ordinary about evil. We want to think only some really monster person could do this, but have you looked at pictures of people, church people, who went out after church and witnessed lynchings? You know, have you seen, you know, those, surely you've seen those pictures of hundreds of people there with their picnic baskets, right? Or have you seen pictures of people spitting on little children, trying to desegregate a school? I mean, there's something about evil that can be ordinary, right? Especially when we push ourselves away from relationships. And the thing that people talk about with Hannah Arendt is, even though this covering the trial in Israel really frayed her friendships, she spent her life trying to hold on to those friendships. She just like went after people because she believed, and it's called the inclusion of the other into the self. She believed that there was a way in which we had to do everything we could to include the other person into ourself, because it also influenced not just our health and our happiness and how long we live, but the well-being of society. And you can see that, like, how many people have walked through that door and said, we went to such and such church, but then our niece came out as gay, our nephew came out as trans, and we had to be in a different kind of place, right? Because when you begin to experience someone different or someone marginalized, it changes you, it changes your politics. But what scholars find is, it's not just that, like, you know somebody with diabetes and you realize, golly, that's really messed up, the way insulin is so expensive. If Judy has a friend with diabetes, it influences my politics. It's not just you have to know the other person. If you know somebody who knows the other person, it changes your own politics. And I keep thinking about Paula's gorgeous sermon 2 weeks ago. It was so beautiful, and she talked about fractals and this kind of idea of kind of a spiral that's repeated throughout all creation. And I keep thinking about, like, what if our life is sort of like this funnel, like this spiral? And we go through life and we're trying in a way to include all of these people somehow into our life, right? Even the people whose politics I abhor. How do we try to, like, wrap these people somehow into our soul? Every single Sunday, Mustafa stood right by the pastor at First Christian Church, Arlington. Not right by Dr. Digby, but by Reverend Richardson, who is our other pastor. And I must have been, I think, a senior in high school, because it was still during the Iran hostage crisis. Those of you old enough to remember, like, these 444 days when our country was really humiliated and people were as rage-filled about people in Iran and Iraq and everywhere in the Middle East. And Mustafa was a refugee that our church was resettling. And I went to school, you know, on Arlington High, University of Texas, Arlington. There was engineering students. And I mean, these people were in fear for their life, because, I mean, every single bumper sticker had some obscene statement about people from Iran and what we were going to do to them and the Shah. Mustafa came to church, and I've never seen a man like him. He had the curliest, biggest hair. It's kind of orange and brown. And I don't know, he must have spoke English, but it was probably his 6th or 7th language. And he stood right by Ross. Everywhere Ross went, Mustafa was right there by him. And as God is my witness, I remember this clearly. He was welcomed and included and beloved. And there was not one person in that church who thought the goal of our church is to convert Mustafa. I don't know if anybody in Texas really knew that there was such a thing as Islam, but everybody knew that he wasn't a Christian. But nobody was like anything but kind and welcoming and caring to him. And that was not lost on me either, right? That Mary Todd was sitting there writing the names of people who were struggling, and Mustafa, who couldn't have looked more different from everybody else in Arlington, Texas, was included too. And what I learned in that whole thing, to be honest, was not just that, the twins who were having surgery mattered, or, the family who'd lost their high school kid, Lane, mattered, or not just that Mustafa mattered. What I learned in that whole thing was that there was a place in God's heart that could never, never, never be challenged for me. I knew in that moment that when I hit rock bottom, when my life fell apart, my name was going to be on that pad, just like every single person. And I knew that as strange and foreign and other and as uncomfortable as I could be with who I am, I knew that I was somehow beloved and held forever in the heart of God. Epiphany. It's a time for us to step back and think, Amazon Prime, it's a really good thing. It's not going to make your life, folks, right? You're not going to live a long, rich life because you can have stuff delivered to your door. You're going to live a long, rich life because you figure out a way to love, to give yourself to a cause that's bigger than who you are, to try to create a world somehow where all of those people scattered far and wide can be brought into our heart and into the heart of God. Amen.